All right, welcome everybody. Glad to see so many people here sharing a lunch with us and learning some more about the legislative session that just concluded last night. I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear me introduce this session by saying this was a historic environmental session at the legislature. I really can't think of a time in the last 2 decades where as much has gotten accomplished at the legislature in a single session. And it's really exciting to be part of that and also to share with you what happened, but also how it happened. And I think our goal today is to have a more of a conversational approach where we kind of get not only into what occurred, and there's a lot to talk about there, but also just kind of how it occurred and how this all came together into this one very concentrated 5-month stretch of environmental policymaking. This conversation, like all of our webinars, is fueled by MCEA supporters, and we want to thank you for your support that allows us to work on these complex issues at the legislature. And now, after the legislature takes action, then in agencies to implement those laws and in courts to defend those laws. And so please consider a contribution to MCEA if you already are not a contributor to help us continue that important work and make more of that work possible. This is going to be our last webinar in our legislative webinar series for 2023. You may have noticed we had fewer of these webinars than we've had in previous sessions. And I think that after you hear from our legislative team, you'll understand why. There was just a lot going on in the legislature, and it required a lot more focus and effort and time than even we expected going into the session. That's why this is one of the most busiest and productive legislative sessions in decades on environmental policy. Also, we're recording this webinar, so if you hear it and you want to share it with one of your friends, or you want to come back to something you heard, you can find it on our YouTube channel and on our website as well. So you can share that with others and also catch up on what you might have missed. So today we have 2 things basically planned. One is to break down the wins, but also how they happen, what comes next to implement these wins, make sure that they are as strong as possible, improvements in environmental justice, protection from toxic chemicals, and other parts of the agenda that passed. But also to answer your questions. We'll hold at least 10 minutes, hoping to get 15 minutes to your questions at the end of the session today. So again, please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to address them throughout the presentation. And then at the end, we'll try to reserve some time there as well. So first of all, I'm Aaron Klemz. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at MCEA, and I have the privilege of working with the legislative team as well as the communications team here at MCEA to make sure that we're communicating with the public. And I want to introduce our 2 primary lobbyists at the legislature this session. First is Andrea Lovoll. Andrea is our legislative director and leads our work at the Minnesota Capitol. And I guess I have, as an introductory question, I just want to ask you, Andrea, what's your origin story as a legislative superhero?
I actually started in academia. I was PhD bound for a long time, studying policy at the academic level and doing some policy debate coaching on the side. So that's kind of where I started. I started in education, studying educational policy. And then when I decided that I didn't want to write a dissertation, I moved to advocacy side, where I started doing some campaign work, and I was involved in a lot of volunteer work for educational policy. Wound up at an organization called Minnesota Citizens for the Arts, where I really got started on lobbying, and then moved on to the environmental side here at MCEA, where I really found a home. So I am really happy to be lobbying for our environment, especially this session.
Awesome. Well, it's ironic that you mentioned that you didn't want to write a dissertation, because I know a little bit about the backstory and the origin story of our other legislative lobbyist, our policy advocate, Dr. Jen Fuller. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your origin story as how you got into policy advocacy and how you ended up here at the legislature this session.
Yeah, definitely. So I was a classic poli-sci major in college, and I actually interned at the Scottish Parliament, and afterwards decided I didn't want to go into politics because politics moves slowly. And it's my first legislative session, and I have found it to be not the case this year. It's been very exciting, and I could have easily been disheartened in a different year, but that's not the case, thankfully. And so I did write the dissertation, and Andrea, you probably made a better choice than I did, focused on solar and energy policy. So I'd done like 15 years of research in policy, and now I'm really finally seeing the behind the scenes, side of it. And it's been a really exciting year.
Awesome. Well, we are really lucky to have both Andrea and Jen on our team and excited to talk a little bit more about the session as it unfolded. So I'm going to start by just kind of trying to frame things, because obviously everyone's been talking about the fact that the DFL control of both the House, the Senate, and the governor, or what people have called a trifecta, made a lot of this possible. But I think that focusing solely on the shift of party control would make us miss some things that happened behind the scenes that also made the progress on environmental policy possible. Obviously, both of those things have to be true at the same time. So I'm going to start with Andrea and just ask, like, besides the shift in party control, what are other conditions that made this historic session possible when we talk about environmental policy?
Yeah, it's a really good question that I think a lot of people, even outside of Minnesota, are asking that question. We're seeing a lot of national attention on Minnesota as people are labeling our state as the beacon of hope for democracy, as a place where progressive policy is happening in contrast to what other states are doing. And so we're seeing a lot of that national attention focused on Minnesota. And I think some of that is because we had such a huge turnover of our legislative body. So when we had redistricting, that always has a high turnover rate. And so we had a huge number of legislators that had retired. And so we have all of these new fresh faces coming in. And there was a really unique difference in who those faces were coming into the legislature. They were younger, they were largely more BIPOC, they were largely more women, and representing identities that typically have not been represented at the Capitol. And so you had a shift in energy in what mattered to the legislative body. And so not only did you have this high energy of new people who really wanted to get things done, but you also had different voices being involved at the legislature. And I really think that that's what made the difference in Minnesota, is that we really had a different type of representation at our state capitol than other states have.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, to add to that, though, and the irony of that is, coupled with, this new set of faces, new set of eyes on environmental policy, you also had years and years of policy development that had happened that had gotten kind of stuck, especially in the House. And some leaders who really understood that, Representative Hansen, who's the chair of the Environment and Natural Resources Committee, Representative Patty Acomb, who's the new chair of the Climate and Energy Committee, but previously that chair was held by Jamie Long, who became the majority leader. And so you had kind of this combination of new faces and new energy with some existing policy that had been developed and some really strong leadership that kind of made that possible. I want to come to a question that we're going to come back to a couple of times, which is, how did all this come together? And I want to ask Jen, and it's a little bit out of order, but just I think this is a good place to ask it. There was a lot of different pieces to this environmental policy puzzle that were led by different organizations and different coalitions of organizations. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that looked like and how it functioned. And I know that you were particularly focused on the Green Bank or Climate Finance Authority provision. Maybe use that as an example about how these coalitions function.
Yeah, so after 100% passed, which a lot of us were focused on, freed up opportunities for us to work on other things in the energy space specifically. So the Minnesota Climate Innovation Finance Authority was spearheaded by Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. There were maybe 6 organizations and folks who were really involved with meeting with representatives and boots on the ground at the Capitol. And we ultimately had over 30 people do sign-on letters, so kind of folks more in the periphery of the support. But yeah, it was nice to work with smaller groups and be able to meet many, many times across the session. True.
I think absolutely true. Let's talk about the wins, because you mentioned the 100% bill. And I think it feels like ancient history at this point. I think when that passed, February 1-ish, kind of right around the turn of January to February. But that's obviously a huge shift. And I'm wondering, Andrea, if you just give us kind of the headline issues that you think were biggest accomplishments for the environmental policy side of environmental legislation.
Yeah, I think that's it's fun to talk about the big headline things because they are really big wins. And I think it's important to note that a lot of these things that we're winning on, that we won on this session, are things that have been in the works for years. And so this, while it feels really monumentous and feels really fast in some ways, these have been in the works for such a long time and are representative of years and years of dedication and policy work by so many people, some of which here at MCEA, and then some legislators and some other organizations that have been working on these pieces. And so some of these headlines, of course, the 100% clean energy standard, which passed in February, and we were able to participate in that bill signing, which was really exciting. And it puts us now on the map for being in line to meet target goals in our energy sector. So that's a really important thing that got done early on. And then, of course, we've also put ourselves on the map in terms of toxic chemical regulation with our PFAS non-essential use ban and information disclosure, which is now titled Amara's Law, after the young woman who dedicated the end of her life to advocating for PFAS, the PFAS ban. And so that's another really big headline. And now, as of that provisions being passed, we have the strongest regulations in the nation in Minnesota. And so it's a really good bar to set as other states are looking for examples on how else that they can do their regulation on toxic chemicals. And then another thing that we made a lot of progress on has been our work on environmental justice collectively as a state, but in particular, the work done by Representative Fu Lee in several bills that he's been carrying for years, alongside the activism of Roxanne O'Brien at CMEJ. And I think that we finally have achieved some of those wins of those bills that have been around for so long. And so those wins of the cumulative impacts bill that we got through in that omnibus bill that would require the MPCA to take into account cumulative impacts before issuing an air permit in an environmental justice area, as well as the reissuances of permits. That is a really big piece of environmental justice that we've succeeded in this session.
Yeah, I was noting that in the question and answer box, there was a question about the getting review. This is Alan Campbell's question about getting review of non-expiring air permits in environmental justice zones. The legislation that passed the session that pertains to non-expiring air permits requires a public hearing on a periodic basis. But does not require them to reapply for those permits. And there's some complications with whether you can break a non-expiring air permit. But at least the involvement of the community was increased, and they have to go to the community with a public meeting on a periodic basis for permits that don't expire. So that was the change that was made in addition to the cumulative impact provisions. Jen, you were focused a lot on the climate and energy provisions for a significant portion of the legislative session. We already talked about the 100% clean energy standard, and folks have probably heard quite a bit about that. What are some of the clean energy and climate wins that you want folks to know about that are beyond the 100% clean energy?
Yeah, definitely is a landmark year. So this year, lawmakers seized on the budget surplus to allocate hundreds of millions of dollars into matching state funds for the Federal Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act money. And I'm really impressed with how much EJ environmental justice language is in these provisions, requiring a lot of the funds to go towards these communities. Another important thing, I'm just doing kind of high level, is there's a lot of money set aside to train and increase the number of workers doing energy efficiency, renewable energy, transportation, and other measures, so we can ensure that we have that workforce. And a lot of these provisions guarantee prevailing wage, which is also really important. Finally, there's a bunch of public outreach requirements, and I will be very curious to see if those are met in order to reach those goals for the EJ community. So getting into the bills that happen, we have the Next Generation Climate Act, which we've been working on for a while, and thanks to our Climate and Energy Director, Ellen Anderson, for continuing to championing that. So we'll be achieving net zero by 2050. With that provision. Of course, the Minnesota Climate Innovation Finance Authority, which we touched on briefly. So this is a quasi-governmental, quasi-public finance authority that will again leverage those federal funds and have private investment so that we can fund smaller projects that big investors just don't want to fund. And then we have a bunch of money for electric vehicles and infrastructure, building out those fast charging stations, training salespeople to be able to sell the cars. Electric panel upgrades, which is something that I didn't really know about until this session. So if you've ever lived in an old house and you've had your breaker tripped because you were using the microwave and the hairdryer at the same time, electric panel upgrades will help deal with this and electrifying the entire economy. So being able to charge EVs at home, get those gas appliances upgraded. And another thing is pre-weatherization. So you've probably heard of weatherization or energy efficiency programs. A lot of folks can't take advantage of those programs because they have things like mold or lead paint in their house. So this kind of fills that gap, and that will enable folks to weatherize their homes. So these are just a few of the things that we worked on, and there's dozens of other provisions that passed this year. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, part of the challenge of this is because climate and energy issues were spread across a variety of bills and a variety of places in the budget. Really, there was kind of like, I don't want to say there was like territories carved out, but I think some organizations focused in different places. I want to acknowledge one question in the Q&A box by Peter Wagenius, who's a friend of ours from Sierra Club and a powerful advocate who worked seemed like mostly on the transportation bill. And he wanted to call out the leadership of Representative Frank Hornstein, and I would add Senator Scott Dibble to that, because there was a ton of information and a ton of progress made on reducing vehicle miles traveled, on reducing the carbon footprint of transportation projects. All of that was really spearheaded and led by a coalition, and Sierra Club was central to that. And so we had a whole host of different coalitions of environmental groups that took on different bodies of work. And for each one of them, there was a legislative champion that really pushed that forward. And it was really only possible to have the progress that we had by having folks kind of dividing up the territory and really taking an emphasis area to focus on. So we want to really acknowledge both Peter and Representative Hornstein and Senator Dibble's work, but note that that's part of the reason why we're not talking a lot about the transportation bill, just because that wasn't an area where MCEA had the resources to focus, but we really congratulate them on all the work that they did there. To come back to something that MCEA worked on, but has been a very so basically before today, no one has heard about this, and we're really excited to tell this story because quietly in both the bonding bill that passed late yesterday and the transportation bill, there were provisions that benefited the Hmong American Farm Association's farm located in the South Metro next to Highway 52. And I'm wondering if, Andrea, if you could talk a little bit about that work and what was accomplished at the legislature in protecting the Hoffa farm.
Yeah, I've been bursting to talk about this because it is so exciting and such an honor to be able to help such an amazing organization of farmers. And the reason that it feels so impactful is that the Hmong American Farming Association property houses a lot of small businesses of smaller farmers, and these smaller farmers do sustainable farming practices. They participate in the Food RX program. They provide food to local hospitals and to schools, and really promotes a lot of sustainable agricultural practices that are good for the environment and good for healthy communities. And so we are a big fan of the Hoffa farm and have built some good relationships with the people who work for that farm. And we received a call for help from them to help with an initiative to help save some of the small businesses who reside in that farm. because there was a proposal from the Department of Transportation and the county to go through the Hoffa farm that would take away portions of land, which would then end certain people's their small businesses as part of that farm. And so that their livelihoods would essentially be gone. And this was a project that was previously bonded for. So they were able to purchase the property via a bonding appropriation. And so we figured out a plan to help them retain their property and retain those small farmers' businesses, their livelihoods, by adding a line in the bonding bill that says that because this project has been bonded for previously, you can't then take it for another project. And so that was a way that allowed the farm to be able to stay intact and to not lose those small businesses. And it doesn't necessarily stop the project as a whole. That's one thing that I want to emphasize, is that they can still do this project, just not in that particular area. And a lot of the experts who have looked at the plans, a lot of the engineering folks, people who have studied the impacts on water quality, would actually have suggested for that project to be in a different place anyway. So this going through the Hoffa farm was not an ideal location. During the middle of this process, when we were talking to the Department of Transportation, they decided to pull their plans for the project. And so in some ways we were delivered an early win, but then we were additionally able to protect this going forward so that the Hoffa farm is protected going forward, even if this particular plan resurfaces again. And we were able to provide them in the transportation budget $2 million for a box culvert, which would allow farmers to go safely from one side of the farm to the other. Right now, as it is, they either have to cross a highway with farming equipment, or they have to go all the way around like a really long distance to be able to get from one side of the farm to the other. And so this allows safe access to both sides of the farm, which is split from Highway 52. So this is something that's really exciting, and so proud to be able to help these small farmers continue sustainable agriculture and providing food and making our communities healthier.
Yeah, if you haven't seen the Hoffa farm before, you probably have actually. If you've driven south on Highway 52 to Rochester, this is a little bit an area southern Dakota County and just a little bit north of Cannon Falls. And the farm is split on either side of Highway 52, which is a very busy road. So we're really excited about both the increase in safety, both for people driving on Highway 52 and also the farm workers who are trying to move farm equipment from across the highway without getting in traffic, and also protecting a really critically important source of sustainable, fresh food that is in everyone's farmers market across the Twin Cities and helps school kids and hospitals and nursing homes across the metro. So it was an exciting project to be a part of, and we're really glad for the final result. What are, to both of you, and you guys can hop in with whatever you think about, but what's another under the radar win? I mean, there's been so much going on that a lot of times people haven't even heard that some things were wins. And I'm wondering if you've got any candidates for under the radar win of the session that you want people to know about. Jen, I'm going to go to you first, if you don't mind.
Oh boy.
Ha.
Man, there's been so many. I mean, I guess right to repair was not under the radar, but we didn't realize that it was in the Commerce Bill because we weren't tracking the Commerce Bill really closely, and that was something we were going to work on for next year. So that was really, really exciting. They had a very lively debate early in session, so I'm really excited to see that pass, and I think that will prompt a lot of really important changes for Minnesota, and again, be a model for the rest of the nation as other states grapple with this as well.
Yeah, I agree. That was a really nice surprise.
Awesome.
that I woke up to. I was planning on talking about how we need to do that next year. And then I get a message from Jen this morning saying, hey, wait, we already did it. So that was a really nice surprise. I would say another under the radar thing that we actually had been working on before session started was we had been talking with the Board of Water and Soil Resources to work on some peatlands protections. And so we supported their efforts in putting in some programs to help repair some of the peatlands, lots of like ditch plugging, so resources to help protect and restore peatlands, which are an incredibly valuable resource in Minnesota. We have a significant amount of peatlands in Minnesota, and I think people really underestimate what they do for our climate and for our environment. They're a natural water filter, so they're really critically important for water quality across the state. They also mitigate water quantity, so they help prevent flooding, which is going to be increasingly important as climate change happens to protect these peatlands and wetlands. And they also are a natural carbon sink. And so there is tons and tons and tons and tons of carbon that are stored in these peatlands. And once those peatlands are destroyed, it takes thousands of years to restore those peatlands back to their state where they were storing that much carbon. So protecting them and preventing them from being destroyed is really critically important to protecting our climate. And so really excited to see the peatlands work as part of Bowser's provisions that we had supported since over the summer, last summer.
Yeah, I want to call out another comment that Alita Boru made in the chat about the fish kills legislation that was included in the environment policy bill as well, the environment budget bill. We worked really hard on this provision, and there were several versions of the language floated around. We think we got the strongest version we could. And it also includes a requirement that the agencies make a recommendation to the legislature before next legislative session about ways to prevent fish kills, as well as a really dramatic improvement in the ways in which fish kills are investigated. And that's important because we've seen an increase of these as climate change has happened and there are more big rain events, especially in southeastern Minnesota, which is really vulnerable to runoff events that can kill fish, especially in these cold water streams that harbor trout. And so we're excited about that work. I mean, just last night, our water program director, Carly Griffith, who's been working on this throughout the session, was down in Winona County talking to folks, about 100 people down in Winona County. There's a lot of energy in southeastern Minnesota around protecting both surface water and groundwater and well water. And that's a big focus for MCEA, both in the legislature, but in our legal work too. I wanted to come back to something that you mentioned before, Andrea, about Amara's law and Amara Strandy and her family and her classmates from Tartan High School, all of whom played a very important role in building the need for action on PFAS forever chemical pollution. And I'm wondering if you talk a little bit about what they did and how important that was for advancing this nation-leading package of forever chemical protections that was part of the environment budget bill.
Yeah, the gift that Amara, her family, and her friends at Tartan High School have given our state and the nation and the world is really tremendous. Amara dedicated the end of her life to trying to ban PFAS so that it wouldn't hurt anybody else. Amara was a really impressive young woman. She had a way with words and was very sincere and authentic in showing up, and really spoke from her heart, and really, I think, woke people up at the legislature and publicly too, to how big this problem really is and how damaging it is. I mean, it really awoke this narrative that hadn't existed before about these cancer clusters that were happening in high schools. So Tartan High School, there's a huge number of students and family members who have cancer as a result of a PFAS plume that is underneath that water supply. And that's because of the amount of PFAS that had been dumped into that water supply for decades from 3M. So it is an incredible gift that Amara and her family has given. They put in so many hours and tireless, like, I can't even tell you how incredible it was to see Amara come to the Capitol very sick. She was not well. She did not feel well. She came in a wheelchair, and she still spoke, and spoke eloquently and powerfully. And it really totally made the difference. Having these personal narratives, I think, and like seeing how it impacts real people is really what made the difference on some of this legislation like PFAS.
Yeah, I want to underscore that. And I mean, how important it was that her story was being told in the media while this debate was happening, I think really, I mean, it's trite to say that it personalized the issue, but I think a lot of times, especially when you're talking about environmental pollution, it's very abstract and it's hard to get your head around what it really means, you know. And I think about the one of her classmates who testified at the legislature who was clearly uncomfortable and had never testified before and kind of stammered out, it's like, I don't know really what to say. You know, I guess I could show you the scar on the back of my head where they took a baseball sized tumor out of my brain. You know, if you want to see the scar, I can show that to you. Otherwise, I don't know what to say really. And you know, that was a moment where like you could hear a pin drop in the room, and you really saw that moment where it's a lot of BS sometimes in the Capitol, and it cut through all of it like a knife in that moment. And you know, if it weren't for people telling their story in those kinds of courageous ways, we might not have seen that progress this session. One other hallmark of this session was that there's a bunch of policies that kind of got stuck and then got unstuck all at once. And I'm wondering if there are some examples of legislation that we could talk about that got done this session after several years of not advancing. Jen, you have any examples of this? I mean, I know you were new this session, so you might be aware of that, or you can go back to Andrea.
Things that were stuck. I mean, Next Generation Climate Act was stuck for a long time. There were interconnection standards for small scale solar that I know people have been working on for a long time. And some of that was rectified this year. There's a couple things I know about. Yeah.
Andrew, you got some examples for that?
I mean, the big one in my head is cumulative impacts, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've been working on this environmental justice provision as part of the Frontline Community Protection Coalition. And you know, we really had commitment from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and from the governor and from both the chairs in the House and the Senate and relative committees that we were going to get it done this year. And there really was this energy of like, yes, we're going to get it done. We're going to work through the problems. We are going to get this passed. And then there's going to be a rulemaking. And the fact that we had that commitment from all of those parties involved, like really made it happen this session. And I am so grateful that that we didn't give up, because there were lots of moments this session and in previous years where it just felt like, oh gosh, is this going to be too hard? But this is such a big deal. We are one of 3 states to have this kind of legislation in place. And we're going to be entering a rulemaking process. So the work is not done. There's still going to be a lot more that we have to do. The rulemaking process is going to be pretty lengthy, and we're still going to have to be able to represent voices that need to be at the table for that rulemaking process. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but this is a really huge step to righting the wrongs of historical environmental racism in our state.
The question in the chat that just popped up that I wanted to answer because it relates to this, and Julie O'Leary asks if this applies statewide or whether it only applies in the metro. And the current language says that it applies in 3 places: the 7-county metropolitan area, cities of the first class, and the 2 cities of the first class in Minnesota that are outside the metro are Duluth and Rochester. And the 3rd area is going to be determined through rulemaking. During the rulemaking process, environmental justice areas that are defined as tribal, or that are areas controlled by tribal governments, will be able to opt into the provision after consultation on the government-to-government basis, which is a really appropriate role for that. I think, you know, the goal of the coalition was a statewide bill. Part of the challenge of getting it through the legislature this session was a need to trim the geographic impact. I think the most important thing to know here is that once that rulemaking is complete, it'll be much easier to apply more broadly. And quite honestly, the experience of implementing this bill in different parts of the geography of Minnesota might make it possible to go statewide quite soon. But as of right now, it applies in those 3 areas. One other thing that I want to
underscore one thing in terms of the tribal opt-in too, because this could be a question that is maybe ruminating in some folks' minds about why it's an opt-in process. So when we, as a coalition, were talking to some of the tribes across the state, some of them really wanted to be included and some did not. And we felt like the collective we in talking with tribes and within the coalition thought it would be a better approach to have the opt-in process to maintain tribal sovereignty and how each tribe can have their own sovereign choice. And that's something that's really important and something that we want to upheld both at MCEA and within the coalition to maintain tribal sovereignty. And so that's really what that provision accomplishes, is for tribes to be able to choose for themselves if they want to be included or not.
Great. And I also wanted to highlight something that was in the question and answers as well from Peter Gove, the esteemed Peter Gove. Thank you for listening, Peter. I'm glad to have you on the webinar, asking about the Environment Natural Resources Trust Fund reauthorization. This did get done this session, and it has been stuck, I would say, for the last several sessions in disputes about what percentage of the lottery funding should go to the general fund versus the Environment Natural Resources Trust Fund. Ultimately, what ended up happening was kind of twofold. One was threefold. One, it goes on the ballot in 2024 for reauthorization, which will ensure, if it is passed by the voters in Minnesota, a continued funding of those environmental projects. Number two, MCEA drafted anti-raid language was added to the constitutional amendment, which also means that some of the concerns about raiding the fund, which had been popping up over the last few years, you may recall MCEA was involved in a lawsuit to end one of those raids. And we were successful in blocking $167 million in raided funds that would have paid for bonding for wastewater treatment plants across the state. And lastly, it also includes a new community grants program. The LCCMR process, the Legislative Commission on Minnesota Resources, Legislative Citizen Commission, I should say, is a really great body, but it also is a really difficult process to get through for a lot of, especially small organizations that might have a really valid project that would work well, but only needs $20,000 or something like that. And it's not worth the amount of time and resources it takes to go through the process. There will be a new community grants program that will allow community organizations to apply for small grants out of the fund as well, and a little bit less onerous and detailed process of the LCCMR follows. So all good wins, and we're excited to see it on the ballot in 2024. It's a remarkably successful and popular program. We expect that it will pass overwhelmingly, and we're really excited to see the development of this new community grants program, which will give increased access to groups in smaller communities across the state, but also groups that may not have ever thought of themselves as being part of that process and accessing those funds. Well, so let's move to the last conversation before we go to some questions. And there's a lot of great questions in the chat, so please keep adding those questions. We'll get to them in just a moment. We talked about the cumulative impact provisions a moment ago, Andrea, but that's not the end of the fight. You mentioned rulemaking, and I'm wondering if you talk a little bit more about what the next steps are in implementing this legislation and what that rulemaking process looks like and what it will do.
Yeah, so the rulemaking process, there's going to be an engagement process with the MCEA and stakeholders to come up with what exactly are the benchmarks that need to be met in order to qualify for a cumulative impacts analysis, what kind of things should be in that cumulative impacts analysis, all of these little details that still need to be hammered out that are not in the statute. And the reason this rulemaking process is important for these particular things to happen in the rulemaking process is because the MCEA's rulemaking process is so comprehensive. They put a lot of monetary resources and have allocated a lot of budget money to go through this really detailed process where they're engaging with the public and all stakeholders. And so one thing that at MCEA that we're going to be really sure to engage on is making sure that the public is represented in their voice in the rulemaking process, to make sure that the voices are being heard and that they're being reflected in how that rulemaking is being done. And so that's really where the next phase of this work is making sure that we are able to get people to participate in that public engagement process and holding MCEA accountable to the things that they say they're going to do. And so all of that is really critically important in the next few years as this rulemaking process happens.
Yeah, one of the key things that's going to happen in this rulemaking process is setting the benchmarks for when you cross into the need for a cumulative impact analysis for existing pollution, right? So one of those things that's going to happen during that process is a really detailed look at what air quality is in different communities and what those benchmarks should be, that as you get past this point, you have to substantially limit, if not end, any involvement. One other thing that's really important that people might not know about the cumulative impact provision is it allows the communities that are affected by pollution to enter into a community benefit agreement with somebody who wants a permit, right? So it's possible that a community will say, you know, we do want this kind of economic development that causes pollution in our community. Here's what we want in exchange. We want these protections from pollution, and we want these community benefits. And so that'll be another part of the rulemaking process that's really hashed out about what those community benefit agreements might look like and how communities can enter into them. And this gives the community a seat at the table for the first time when it comes to some of these highly polluted, overburdened communities where we already have a large concentration of industrial development that causes pollution that's already causing harm to the community. So it's a really exciting time. And MCEA is an expert in rulemaking. We have lawyers that have been engaged in it across the board. So we're excited to get involved in this and to really make sure that the community is well represented, because we know that industry will be. Industry will have their lawyers there. They will try to water this down. MCEA will be there to make sure that it is a strong resulting process. Jen, I wanted to turn back to climate for a minute about what happens next too. There's a ton of funding for a host of climate priorities. You talked about a few of them earlier in the webinar. What should people be watching for in terms of how they can access funds for weatherization, pre-weatherization, heat pumps, EV incentives, and stuff like that was in the climate and energy bill?
So the good news is the EV rebates will be upfront. So you'll get those right when you go purchase the vehicle, and there's restrictions on like cost of vehicle and whatnot. So that'll be really easy. Pre-weatherization and weatherization will still be promoted through commerce and county level energy assistance programs. Heat pumps, there's a maximum $4,000 rebate, and then you have to have like an energy audit. So there's all these little constrictions on it, but some of the programs include community navigators, which is really, really important, especially for smaller groups and low-income folks. So what this does is it helps people apply for grants. It helps cut through all the red tape. So that's something I'm excited to looking forward to seeing.
Awesome. Andrea, we've heard throughout the session at times where big changes have been made, threats of legal action, and we expect some legal challenges from industry and others to challenge legislation. What are some of the examples of where MCEA might get involved in protecting some of these legislative wins from legal challenges?
Well, the obvious one that comes to mind is with 100% clean energy. There's a lot of discussion around whether or not this will be challenged by North Dakota. That is something that foreseeably MCEA could get involved in to protect the 100% clean energy standard in Minnesota should it be challenged in court. So that is one thing that sticks out in my mind. There are other provisions as well. So you know, we've been involved in the past in clean cars rulemaking. So whenever there's a rulemaking process, as there is with a lot of things that pass this session, there is always a potential for some kind of legal action. And in those cases, MCEA would likely get involved in that as well. So if there are challenges with the rulemaking, for example, with cumulative impacts or with PFAS, with those important rulemaking processes, we would be involved in protecting that from staying its course.
I mean, since you mentioned clean cars, I just want to point out how crazy it is that for the last, I don't know, 2 years, there's been nothing but like big fights in the legislature about a clean cars rulemaking that honestly was good, but it wasn't like groundbreaking. It certainly wasn't as transformative as some of the policies that were adopted this year. And also to note that one of the key lawsuits challenging it from the Minnesota Auto Dealers Association is now dead in the water. It was rejected by the Court of Appeals, and the Minnesota Supreme Court did not take it up. There is another federal lawsuit that MCEA is also watching regarding a challenge to the Clean Cars Minnesota rules. But to some extent, we've kind of moved way past that debate in just one session and moving on to implementing EV infrastructure and EV purchase incentives to try to really maximize the adoption of electric vehicles in Minnesota. One last thing is what work didn't get done. I mean, we got a lot done, but there's work left. There's obviously you're never done. So I guess the question is, what are some bodies of work that MCEA was involved in during the 2023 session that we look forward to picking up again in 2024. And I'll start with Andrea and then we'll go to Jen.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been working on all session is some work for water protections. The one that specifically comes to mind is our work on the drainage registry portal, which we got some language in there to help figure out a plan for going forward with this. But we didn't get the exact result that we were looking for in essentially taking what is public information and making it searchable and accessible so that it's actually public. And that's kind of our goal. Is it's a transparency kind of issue when it comes to our water quality and protecting our water quality, so we know what projects are happening across the state that might impact our water quality and quantity. And so that is an issue that we will be taking up in future sessions to help make this more transparent of a process and make it easier for the public to protect public water resources.
Anything you want to add there, Jen?
Yeah, so there are a couple waste provisions. I saw a question in the chat about the zero waste and progress on that. So it looks like there is a report commissioned in the omnibus bill, but the zero waste grants were not included. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. So we were disappointed to see that. And then also e-waste recycling is another thing that we're eager to work on for next year. It's so important. It dovetails with our mining the climate crisis work. So we'll be working on that next year as well.
Excellent. Well, and we've got a ton of really great questions in the question and answer period. We've got about 10 minutes or so left in the webinar. We'd love to turn to some of these. And I wanted to start with a question from Chris Cowan. Chris is a lobbyist we know well. He works with Pesticide Action Network. And his question was about PFAS, and particularly there was a kind of last minute swerve in the authority of who's going to regulate PFAS compounds for other forever chemical compounds in pesticides. And he asked, some of us feel that a PFAS pesticide ban starting in 2032 with big loopholes needs work. What are your thoughts about moving forward on that? And Andrea, I think you've been leading this work, so let's let you take a whack at it.
Yeah, that's a really great question. This has been a really complicated issue of you know, how exactly, like, where do we draw the line with what is essential, what is non-essential, what are we tackling first, what is the most prevalent problem, etc. And then who is in charge of regulating that problem. And so in terms of pesticides, there were some I think some disagreement on who should be in charge of regulating that particular entity. And so there's going to be more people coming to the table for that conversation. But one thing that Ivana Stark Ivana Stark is the State Director for Clean Water Action. She's been my partner in working in PFAS legislation this whole session. And we are having conversations with both agricultural stakeholders as well as the chairs of the ag committees in each relative body to figure out a plan going forward so that we can move as swiftly as we can with regulating PFAS and pesticides. Because it is a problem and it needs to be addressed. And personally, I think the ag sector might be the next frontier in PFAS work as we talk about pesticides and agricultural, like sludge spreading, for example, is another area that we'll have to start looking into as well, and how PFAS is affecting our agricultural lands as it is in Maine. And I think some of those same problems that they've been really focused on in Maine are going to be replicated here. We're going to see a lot of those same problems pop up. And so we have to be ready for that fight. And pesticides is one big part of that. So I see in no way that work is done. I think that there's still a lot of work to do on PFAS, and particularly PFAS in the agricultural sector and pesticides and in sludge. And something that we'll be eager to tackle in future sessions.
I mean, one thing that I just want to highlight from this work is how much we learned throughout the session as this was moving forward about what people don't know about where these forever chemicals are located. Like there's only some really limited testing data right now on pesticides and which ones contain PFAS. But as you went through the session, it became more and more obvious that there's just no one who's got their arms around what that problem actually looks like. And so one of the things that we're excited about is honestly the disclosure requirements in these laws. So they require people to say when they're using it, and then to use that as a way of holding manufacturers accountable, but also our state agencies accountable in terms of how they implement these laws. And that includes the Department of Ag, and it includes the Pollution Control Agency. I want to acknowledge a couple of questions in the chat from Tess and from Alita about Prove It First and boundary waters protection bills and mining bills. That is one area that this legislature did not take on at all. And they want to know an update about those bills. And do you want to take a whack at that, Andrea, or do you want me to do that?
If you'll take that, I'm sorry. I'm looking through the chat to see other questions here. So you go ahead and take that one while I'm looking.
Sure. So, I mean, I think those are good questions. And I think it's fair to say that this legislative session, the goal was to find things that people could all get behind and get done. And if there's one thing that's true about Prove It First and the boundary waters protection bill is that there are some divisions inside the DFL caucus itself that makes it difficult to get to the majority needed to pass those bills. It's disappointing, but I think it's true. And I think, you know, the focus of the session was to get as much done as possible, as fast as possible. I think it's very likely that bills like Prove It First and the Boundary Waters Protection Bill will get more attention next year because they do not require budgetary allocations to implement them in quite the same way that a big rulemaking on cumulative impact or implementing the PFAS regulations will take. So I think there's hope for that in 2024, but it was a notable absence. And quite honestly, you know, if you were at the Capitol, like I was for the Prove It First rally, look, there's like 57 co-sponsors in the House of Prove It First. And I know that there's similar numbers of people that support the Boundary Waters Protection Bill. So we're hopeful that in 2024, we can finally break the blockade and actually have a real conversation about mining legislation at the Minnesota legislature, one that hasn't happened in over a decade. And that is, but that is one gap in the coverage of this legislative session when it comes to the issues that didn't get addressed throughout the session. Let's go look at some other stuff too. Jen, you were looking at the question and answer. Is there anything in there you want to grab and talk about a little bit?
Yeah, someone had asked if multifamily buildings are included in the electrical panel provision. Yes, they are. So they could be funded of up to $50,000 per building. So that's something that's super important to me as a renter. And yeah, so yes, that's included. There's some questions about right to repair. It looks like tractors are excluded, which is really annoying. And then electric school buses did get money. Yay! So did solar on schools and solar on public buildings so.
Well, one of the things one of our board members was asking about at our board meeting earlier last week was about a provision that would prohibit homeowners associations from stopping people from putting solar on their buildings. And that passed, by the way, after something like 8 years of kicking around and not passing. It passed this year. So there's fewer restrictions on homeowners. Homeowners associations cannot put restrictions on people's ability to put solar on their own homes basically anymore as a result of that legislation. Tess also asked about smart salting, which is a good question, and it's something that MCEA has emphasized in the past couple sessions, especially last session. We made a really concerted effort to try to get smart salting legislation passed. It was early in the session introduced. It got a hearing in the Senate. It became pretty clear that it wasn't going to advance in the House, and so again, as triage kind of happened throughout the session, it was dropped on the wayside. I will say that our advocates have been working on that bill for a long time, such as Sue Neeson from Stop Over Salting. A lot of the watershed management districts and watershed management organizations across the metro especially are really engaged on chloride pollution. We look forward to talking to them in the off session to try to kind of come up with a new strategy because this bill, which is a really smart bill, which you are familiar with from the last couple of sessions, just hasn't gone anywhere. And so it's worth reconsidering what that strategy might look like because chloride pollution continues to increase and awareness of the need to do something has also increased. And so the one good thing on chloride I will highlight is that the MCEA now has the ongoing authority to collect fees and administer the smart salting education and training programs that previously had been funded on a kind of patchwork basis through a variety of grants. And so now they are able to charge fees and then use those fees to keep the program going. And that means that very successful voluntary program can at least continue. And that's something that is a good win for the salting issue. Peter asks about whether HOAs it corresponds to existing. My understanding, and I'm not an expert, I had to look at the provision again. It looks to me like it prohibits restrictions on solar in HOA agreements. So it should be retroactive to previous agreements and not apply just to new ones. But I'm not exactly clear on that. A couple questions. Caitlin just brought up another one, 404 assumptions. So for folks who don't know about that, there is a wetlands law under the Clean Water Act called Section 404, which is a federal protection against wetlands destruction. And there's also a state law called the Wetlands Conservation Act that applies. And there have been a number of attempts. I just looked at a document we found in our office the other day from 1988 talking about Section 404 assumptions. So it's been going around for a very long time, almost 40 years. Andrea, do you have any updates about the Section 404 and what you expect to see in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it with agencies early in the session, and there is interest in discussing 404 assumption at the legislature with agencies, but that did not rise to the list of priorities this session. So I think that's something that sort of fell off the wayside this session, and I don't expect that to be done. I think that will pop up in future years, and we'll be ready to have that conversation when it does. So I think that maybe next session, there may be more of a conversation, given that it's not going to be a budget year next session.
And if I recall correctly, the Board of Water and Soil Resources, which is the agency that's primarily charged with implementing the Wetlands Conservation Act, had requested funding for a study on 404 assumption, but that was not included in the budget. And so even funding for studies to implement 404 assumption were dropped. And lastly, for folks who don't know, I think there are 3 other states, I think it's New Jersey, Michigan, and Florida, that have assumed 404 authority in their state. And in all 3 of those states, there's been a big problem with a lack of protections for wetlands. And so we would be really cautious about seeing that here in Minnesota, and generally skeptical about the idea, period. And we'll continue that stance. Got just a couple minutes left.
There was one other question that I wanted to address that was in the Q&A that I think is a really good way to maybe kind of wrap up the questions. I'm kind of putting a couple of these together because I think that they're related, and that is how MCEA was able to influence some of the priorities at the legislature this session, as well as how legislators relied on MCEA's guidance and resources. And I think those 2 things are very related. MCEA is known as being a resource at the legislature, and we've been working really hard at developing really important relationships at the legislature with leadership who trusts us to do the work. And so we've seen a lot of trust and a lot of reliance on MCEA's legal staff and our policy experts to put together recommendations regarding the cumulative impacts legislation that we put through, PFAS legislation, drainage legislation, you name it. We've been relied on in a lot of different ways. And I also think that something that goes maybe a little bit more unnoticed is the way that our communications team at MCEA has helped shape the narrative at the legislature as well. And I think that's a really important thing to point out, is how amazing our communications team at MCEA is as well. Because with their work, we have been in a ton of op-eds. We've been quoted in the press a lot. We've had a really visible presence. And because of that, the way that we are talking about some things are being repeated. So for example, some of the things that that we wrote are being repeated as part of that narrative. So when we say, we need to turn off the tap of PFAS, that phrase has been repeated over and over again, that 3M is Minnesota is the origin story of PFAS, and that is being repeated. And so in some ways, our communications team has been really central in shaping some of the narrative at the legislature as well. And I really want to applaud our communications team for how excellent they have framed this legislative session.
Yeah, it's a really good way of ending this. And I also just want to say, I've noticed there's more questions in the chat that are great questions. I mean, Tom Casey's in there asking about how we can help advance lead ammo and lead sinker bans in the future, which we worked with him on in the past. That's an exciting area that we got to keep on working on, because while there was a little bit of progress this session, in terms of at least $1 million put aside to like get the lead out program. There's still no requirements to end the use of lead. And then one last question I saw from Malcolm about was a particular question about vermiculite in their attic, and one of the challenges, that's really what the pre-weatherization program is about. And in fact, I think there's still some details that need to come out about that, but you should keep your eye out for that, Malcolm, because I think those kinds of problems of like having vermiculite or lead paint or other things that need to be addressed before weatherization can be done is the exact purpose of that pre-weatherization program. And there's about $40 million set aside for that. So there's a lot of funds available for that work. With that, I'm afraid we're going to have to end our time. It's past 1 o'clock, and I appreciate the time that you spent with us. I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank everyone who took action with MCEA over the course of this legislative session. Over 2,800 people contacted their legislator, emailing them about particularly important moments in the legislative session to advance some of these initiatives. And that mattered. People pay attention when their constituents contact their elected leaders, and you did that. And because you did that, we were able to advance these initiatives at the legislature. So thank you for that. One last thing you might be not aware of is Governor Walz is going to sign many of the budget bills, including the Environment and Natural Resources budget and climate budget, on the steps of the Capitol tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. So if you're the kind of person who likes to be where history is being made, this is a good chance for you to show up at the legislature and to see the governor sign those bills into law.
I'll be there. Come find me.
Yeah, come find us. MCEA will be there. And lastly, just thank you for supporting our work. We genuinely can't do this without you. If you haven't already become a donor and supporter of MCEA, please do join us. There's a link in the chat, or just go to our website and click donate. And again, we couldn't do this work without you. We really appreciate you and all the work that you've done to make this historic, decades-long, session possible. We were able to get a decade's worth of work done in one session, and we want to do it again next year. So join us. And again, thank you for all your work and all the work that you've done. And we hope to see you soon. Thanks again from MCEA, and have a great day.